The salt spray kissed the emerald shores of Northumbria, a gentle caress on a land bathed in the golden light of a burgeoning summer. Here, upon the sacred isle of Lindisfarne, the rhythm of life was dictated not by the clang of steel, but by the sonorous chants of monks and the turning of prayer wheels. The year was 793 AD. For generations, Lindisfarne had stood as a beacon of piety, a jewel of Christendom nestled precariously on the edge of the known world, a testament to the quiet, ordered faith that had taken root in the heart of Anglo-Saxon England. Its stone walls, weathered by sea winds and centuries of devotion, enclosed a sanctuary of learning and prayer, a place where the divine was sought through contemplation and the meticulous illumination of sacred texts. The monks, cloaked in their rough woolens, moved with a serene purpose, their days a tapestry woven with scripture, liturgy, and the cultivation of the land that sustained them. Outside these hallowed precincts, the nobles of Northumbria, men accustomed to the occasional skirmishes with their Celtic neighbors or the ever-present threat of internal strife, spoke of the distant lands to the north with a mixture of dismissive curiosity and outright derision. Tales of the Norsemen, the pagans from the north, filtered through trade routes and the whispers of wary mariners, were often met with incredulity, painted as the savage ramblings of uncivilized peoples, a far cry from the refined culture and established order of the Anglian kingdoms. The idea that these distant barbarians, whose very existence seemed a myth conjured from the mists of the Baltic, could pose any genuine threat to the established powers of the South was, to them, a ludicrous notion, a jest to be shared over goblets of mead. They envisioned these northerners as crude hunters and fishermen, their lives as harsh and untamed as the frozen landscapes they supposedly inhabited, incapable of the sophisticated strategies or the sheer audacity that would be required to challenge the dominion of Christian rulers. The very notion was an affront to their sense of superiority, a concept so alien to their worldview that it was easily dismissed as the fanciful exaggeration of fearful travelers. Lindisfarne, with its tranquil atmosphere and its profound spiritual significance, represented the pinnacle of this ordered world, a symbol of all that was precious and worth defending, yet utterly secure in its perceived invincibility. Its isolation, once a source of spiritual purity, was now, unbeknownst to its inhabitants, becoming a fatal vulnerability. The sea, which had for so long been their silent protector, the vast expanse that separated them from the perceived chaos of the world, was about to become the harbinger of a terror so profound, so utterly shattering, that it would forever alter the course of history. The whispers from the north, dismissed as mere folklore, were about to coalesce into a terrifying reality, a storm gathering on the horizon, poised to break upon the unsuspecting shores of England. The laughter of the English nobility, so confident in their perceived security, would soon turn to screams of horror. The sea, that vast, indifferent expanse, had always been a conduit for the people of the north, a highway connecting scattered settlements and fueling a spirit of restless exploration. From the rugged fjords of Norway, the windswept coasts of Denmark, and the mist-shrouded islands of Sweden, emerged a people forged by the unforgiving elements. The Norsemen, or Vikings, as they would come to be known. These were not the pastoral farmers or the settled artisans of the South. They were a warrior society, their lives intrinsically linked to the sea and the pursuit of glory, wealth, and the favor of their gods. Their longships, sleek and menacing, were marvels of engineering for their time, capable of navigating both the treacherous open ocean and the shallowest of rivers, allowing them to strike with devastating speed and surprise. These vessels, powered by oar and sail, were the instruments of their ambition, carrying them across vast distances to trade, explore, and, increasingly, to raid. The traditional image of the Viking is one of brutal, unthinking savagery, but the reality was far more nuanced. They were skilled seafarers, shrewd traders, and formidable warriors, bound by complex social structures and a rich tapestry of mythology. Their gods, Odin, Thor, and Freya, were deities of power, war, and fertility, their worship often intertwined with the harsh realities of survival. Yet their motivations for venturing south were not solely born of bloodlust. Overpopulation, internal conflicts, and the lure of richer lands and spoils fueled their expeditions. They sought not just plunder, but also new territories to settle, trade routes to control, and a reputation that would echo through the sagas. And for these seasoned adventurers, the established centers of wealth and religious devotion in the south particularly those situated on accessible coastlines, presented irresistible targets. Lindisfarne, with its renowned monastery, brimming with precious artifacts, illuminated manuscripts, and likely stored wealth, was a prize of immense value. It was also, crucially, a place of profound spiritual significance, a symbol of the Christian faith that the Norsemen viewed with a mixture of contempt and curiosity. To attack such a place was not merely an act of brigandage, it was a calculated strike at the heart of a rival culture, a demonstration of power and dominance that would send shockwaves through the Christian world. The monks of Lindisfarne, steeped in an ethos of peace and contemplation, were utterly unprepared for the sudden, brutal eruption of violence that was about to shatter their tranquil existence. They had prayed for divine protection, but they had not prepared for the earthly manifestation of pagan fury that was even then sailing towards their shores, borne on the very winds that had once whispered tales of distant lands. The sun, a benevolent eye in the heavens, cast long shadows across the tranquil waters surrounding Lindisfarne. The monks, their faces etched with the quiet devotion of men who had dedicated their lives to the divine, went about their daily rituals. The air was filled with the soft murmur of prayers, the rustle of parchment, and the distant cry of gulls. It was a scene of almost unbearable peace, a picture of serene piety that had endured for centuries. But this peace was a fragile illusion, a thin veneer stretched over a world teetering on the brink of an unprecedented upheaval. Far to the north, unseen and unheard by the inhabitants of this sacred isle, a new kind of vessel cut through the waves, not the sturdy merchant ships of the south nor the fishing smacks that plied the local waters, but the sleek, dragon-headed longships of the Norsemen. These were the instruments of a new era, their black sails like predatory wings against the horizon, their oars beating a relentless rhythm that spoke of purpose and deadly intent. For weeks, perhaps months, these ships had been a constant presence on the northern seas, their crews driven by a hunger for plunder and a thirst for glory that had propelled them across the unforgiving waters. They were the harbingers of a storm, a force of nature unleashed upon the unsuspecting shores of Anglo-Saxon England. Lindisfarne, with its reputation for wealth and its perceived vulnerability, was their chosen target. The monks, so accustomed to the gentle rhythms of their isolated existence, had no defenses, no warriors to repel an assault, no concept of the ferocity that was about to descend upon them. Their faith, their learning, their very lives, were about to be tested in a crucible of fire and blood. The first sign was not a trumpet call or a warning cry, but a sudden terrifying silence that fell upon the sea. The gulls ceased their clamor, the waves seemed to hold their breath, and then, from the mist-shrouded horizon, they emerged. A fleet of longships, their menacing prows like snarling beasts, bearing down upon the island with an unnatural speed. The sight alone was enough to shatter the serene facade of Lindisfarne. Panic, a primal, unreasoning terror, began to ripple through the monastery. The monks, their faces pale and drawn, stumbled from their cells, their prayers turning to desperate pleas as the roar of the approaching raiders filled the air. The longships beached themselves upon the sands, disgorging their occupants with a ferocity that was almost inhuman. These were not men seeking parley or trade. They were a force of destruction, clad in mail and leather, wielding axes and swords, their faces contorted by the thrill of battle. They swarmed the island. The sanctuary of Lindisfarne was violated in an instant. The sacred stones, which had for so long echoed with hymns of praise, now reverberated with the screams of the dying and the clash of steel against bone. The Vikings, driven by a primal ferocity, showed no mercy. They tore through the monastery, their pagan eyes gleaming with a mixture of greed and contempt for the Christian clerics. Precious artifacts, chalices, reliquaries, and the priceless illuminated manuscripts that represented generations of devoted labor were ripped from their places, plundered for their gold and silver. The very symbols of faith were desecrated, treated as mere objects of material value. The monks, caught defenseless, were cut down where they stood, their pleas for mercy falling on deaf ears. Some were killed outright, their lives extinguished in a brutal instant. Others, it is said, were dragged away, their fate a chilling testament to the ruthlessness of their attackers. The air, once thick with the scent of incense and sea salt, became choked with the acrid smell of smoke and the coppery tang of blood. Lindisfarne, the jewel of Northumbrian piety, was being systematically dismantled, its sacred heart ripped out and its hallowed halls stained with the blood of its devoted guardians. The serene beauty of the island was transformed into a scene of utter devastation, a stark and brutal testament to the arrival of a new, terrifying power. The laughter of the English nobility, so dismissive of the northern threat, was about to be drowned out by a wave of horror and fear that would sweep across the land. The dawn that broke over Lindisfarne on that fateful day in 793 AD was not one of renewal, but of utter devastation. The once sacred stones, now stained with blood and strewn with the debris of shattered devotion, bore witness to a horror that had been unimaginable just hours before. The surviving monks, those few who had managed to hide or escape the initial onslaught, emerged from their terrified sanctuaries into a landscape of unimaginable carnage. The air was thick with the stench of death and the lingering smoke of fires that had reduced precious libraries and sacred chapels to smoldering ruins. Their eyes, wide with shock and disbelief, scanned the scene of desecration. The treasures of Lindisfarne, the culmination of centuries of painstaking labor and fervent faith, were gone, plundered by the pagan invaders. The illuminated manuscripts, works of art and spiritual devotion that had taken years to create, were either destroyed or carried away as trophies. The gold and silver that adorned the altars and reliquaries, once symbols of divine glory, were now in the hands of the raiders, their lust for material wealth insatiable, but it was the fate of their brethren that truly tore at their souls. The bodies of the slain monks lay scattered across the island, a grim testament to the brutality of the assault. Clergy, men of peace and learning, who had dedicated their lives to prayer and contemplation, had been slaughtered with a ferocity that defied comprehension. Some had met their end defending their sacred texts, others while attempting to flee, and still others, it is whispered in hushed tones, had been taken captive, their ultimate fate a chilling unknown. The silence that had fallen upon the island was not the peaceful quiet of devotion, but the heavy, suffocating silence of death. The survivors, their bodies trembling with a mixture of fear and grief, could do little but stare, their minds struggling to comprehend the magnitude of the tragedy. This was not a raid for territory or political gain. This was an assault on the very soul of their faith, a brutal violation of all they held sacred. The news, carried by terrified survivors who fled the island in makeshift boats, spread like wildfire through Northumbria and beyond. It reached the ears of the Christian rulers, men who had previously dismissed the tales of the Norsemen as fanciful exaggerations. Now the accounts of the Lindisfarne raid painted a starkly different picture. Scribes, their hands shaking, recorded the horrifying details in their chronicles. Alcuin of York, a renowned scholar and advisor to Charlemagne, writing from the safety of the Frankish court, expressed his profound despair and horror. He penned letters filled with anguish, lamenting the desecration of the holy place and the slaughter of its innocent inhabitants. He spoke of the Vikings as wolves devouring the sheep of Christ, their savagery a divine punishment for the sins of Christendom, yet a terrifying reality that could no longer be ignored. The Christian rulers, men who had perhaps seen the Norse as distant, uncivilized pagans, were forced to confront a chilling new reality. The barbarians from the north were not a myth. They were a tangible, terrifying force capable of audacious raids and brutal violence, a force that could strike at the very heart of their kingdoms, leaving behind only destruction and despair. The fear that gripped the land was palpable, a chilling foreboding that this was not an isolated incident but the dawn of a new and terrifying era. The peaceful shores of England, once considered secure, were now exposed and vulnerable, and the laughter of the English nobility had been replaced by a collective shudder of dread. The ashes of Lindisfarne settled not just upon the ravaged island, but upon the very consciousness of Anglo-Saxon England. The raid was more than just a brutal act of violence. It was a seismic shift, a brutal awakening that shattered the illusion of security and irrevocably altered the perception of the Norsemen. For centuries, the peoples of the South had viewed the inhabitants of the northern seas with a mixture of curiosity and disdain, a distant, primitive folk whose existence was largely confined to the realm of folklore and exaggerated tales. They were the pagans from the north, a phrase uttered with a dismissive wave of the hand, a people incapable of understanding the nuances of civilized society, let alone posing a genuine threat to the established order of Christian kingdoms. The very idea of these disparate Seemingly unsophisticated tribes venturing south with any strategic intent was met with amusement. They were seen as raiders perhaps, but opportunistic, disorganized, and easily repelled. Lindisfarne, with its profound spiritual significance and its perceived isolation, represented the pinnacle of this perceived invincibility. Its sanctity was its shield, its remoteness its guardian. But the longships that had sliced through the waves that day carried with them not just plunder, but a terrifying new reality. The meticulously documented accounts of the raid, the horrified testimonies of the few survivors, and the anguished lamentations of scholars like Alcuin of York painted a starkly different picture. They spoke of a highly organized, ruthlessly efficient force, capable of striking with lightning speed and leaving behind a trail of devastation. The Vikings were not merely wild barbarians. They were skilled seafarers, formidable warriors, and strategic thinkers who understood the value of surprise and the impact of targeting symbols of power and wealth. The desecration of Lindisfarne was not just an act of looting. It was a calculated assault on the heart of Christian authority in the region, a brutal demonstration of pagan power against a deeply revered religious center. This act of sacrilege sent a shockwave of fear and outrage across Christendom. It exposed the vulnerability of even the most sacred and seemingly protected places. The divine protection that the monks had prayed for had seemingly failed, leaving them exposed to the raw, unbridled fury of the Norsemen. The myth of the distant, harmless pagans was shattered, replaced by the chilling reality of a relentless, encroaching force. This raid marked the undeniable beginning of the Viking Age in England, not as a slow infiltration, but as a sudden, violent eruption. The fear and humiliation of that day became deeply ingrained in the collective memory of the English people. It was a scar that would not easily fade, a stark reminder that the world they thought they knew was about to be fundamentally reshaped by the iron will and relentless ambition of the Norsemen. The sea, once a symbol of peaceful connection and trade, had become a highway for invasion, and the laughter of the English nobility had been silenced, replaced by the chilling whispers of dread that would echo for centuries to come. The echoes of Lindisfarne resonate not as a distant historical footnote, but as a profound testament to the enduring power of fear, the fragility of perceived security, and the transformative nature of unexpected violence. The raid was not merely a historical event, a brutal chapter in the annals of Anglo-Saxon England. It was a stark unveiling of a world order on the cusp of radical change. The monks who meticulously illuminated their manuscripts, the nobles who dismissed distant threats with a patronizing smile, represented an established way of life, a faith-based civilization that believed itself to be insulated from the raw, untamed forces lurking beyond its borders. Lindisfarne, a sanctuary of prayer and learning, was a potent symbol of this ordered world, its isolation a source of spiritual purity, its perceived remoteness a natural defense. Yet, it was precisely this perceived security, this very isolation, that rendered it so tragically vulnerable. The arrival of the Norse longships was not just the arrival of a raiding party. It was the arrival of a different worldview, a culture forged by the harsh realities of a demanding environment, a people whose gods were of war and strength, and whose ambition was as boundless as the ocean they navigated. The symbolic meaning of the Lindisfarne raid is multifaceted and deeply resonant. It speaks to the perennial human tendency to underestimate the unknown, to dismiss threats that lie beyond our immediate experience or comprehension. The laughter of the English nobility was the sound of hubris, the confident dismissal of a reality that had not yet directly impacted their lives. The raid served as a brutal, undeniable corrective, forcing a confrontation with a force that was not only powerful but also utterly alien to their understanding. It highlighted the stark contrast between a civilization that valued contemplation and divine protection, and one that prized martial prowess, daring, and material acquisition. The Vikings, in their ruthless efficiency, demonstrated that faith alone was not a sufficient defense against earthly aggression. This event also represents a profound clash of cultures and belief systems. The desecration of a sacred site, the slaughter of men of God, was a direct assault on the very foundations of Christian society. It was a visceral reminder that the world was not solely governed by divine will, but also by the brutal realities of human conflict and ambition. The horror and fear that gripped England were not just about the loss of material wealth or the lives of a few monks. They were about the shattering of a worldview, the dawning realization that their cherished civilization was not an impregnable fortress, but a vulnerable outpost in a world far more dangerous and unpredictable than they had ever imagined. The raid on Lindisfarne therefore serves as an archetypal story of the confrontation between the known and the unknown, the civilized and the seemingly savage, the established order and the disruptive force of change. It forces us to consider the assumptions we make about those who are different from us, the dangers of complacency, and the ever-present reality that even the most sacred spaces can be violated. The chilling winds that swept across the North Sea in 793 AD carried more than just the scent of salt and the cry of gulls. They carried the dawn of a new era, an age defined by the thunder of Viking longships and the stark realization that the world was far larger and far more perilous than many had believed. The raid on Lindisfarne was not merely an isolated act of brutality, a fleeting moment of terror that would eventually fade into the mists of history. It was a fulcrum, a turning point that irrevocably altered the trajectory of England and, indeed, much of Europe. The laughter that had once echoed through the halls of Northumbrian nobility, dismissive of the pagans from the north, was replaced by a gnawing fear, a chilling understanding that the distant tales of fierce warriors and their dragon-proud ships were not mere folklore, but a tangible, terrifying reality. This event stripped away the veneer of perceived invincibility that had cloaked the Christian kingdoms, exposing their vulnerabilities to the relentless ambition of the Norsemen. Lindisfarne, once a symbol of serene piety and intellectual pursuit, became a stark monument to the consequences of underestimation and the brutal effectiveness of a culture forged by hardship and a thirst for expansion. The meticulously crafted manuscripts, the sacred relics, the very stones of the monastery, bore witness to a violation that transcended mere physical destruction. It was an assault on the spiritual and cultural heart of Anglo-Saxon England. The terror unleashed that day was not confined to the island itself. It rippled outwards, carried by the desperate accounts of survivors, igniting a wave of dread that would soon engulf the entire realm. The meticulous chroniclers, the learned scholars like Alcuin of York, captured this profound shock, their writings serving as enduring testaments to the sheer horror and disbelief that such an event could transpire. They spoke of the Vikings as a scourge, a divine punishment, yet their words also conveyed a deep-seated fear of a force that seemed almost elemental in its destructive power. The Lindisfarne raid was the opening salvo in a long and often brutal chapter of English history. It was the moment when the myth of the distant, uncivilized barbarian was shattered, replaced by the stark reality of a formidable, highly mobile, and deeply motivated enemy. The consequences were profound and far-reaching. It spurred the development of more sophisticated defenses, necessitated a greater degree of unity among the fragmented Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and ultimately shaped the very identity of England as it grappled with the persistent threat and eventual settlement of the Norse peoples. The echo of Lindisfarne is a timeless reminder that perceived security can be a dangerous illusion, that the unknown should not be met with derision, but with vigilance, and that the forces of change, however brutal, can forge new realities and redefine the course of human history. It asks us to consider, when does the whisper of a distant threat become the roar of an undeniable reality? And how do we, in our own times, confront the challenges that lie beyond our comfortable horizons? The shockwaves from Lindisfarne did more than merely introduce a new threat. They fundamentally altered the very psychology of Anglo-Saxon England. Before 793 AD, the island monastery represented an almost divine bulwark, a place where the spiritual realm was so potent that it was perceived as inherently protected. The monks themselves were seen as conduits of divine favor, their prayers a more potent shield than any earthly fortification. This deep-seated belief in spiritual invincibility, however, proved tragically misplaced. The brutal efficiency of the Viking assault shattered this illusion, forcing a stark confrontation between faith and brute force. This psychological rupture wasn't about a loss of faith, but rather a profound reevaluation of its efficacy in the face of tangible, earthly violence. It compelled a recognition that divine protection, while a cornerstone of their worldview, required practical, human-led defenses to complement it. Consider how this might manifest today. Imagine a community that relies solely on prayer for safety, only to be confronted by a sudden, overwhelming physical danger. The ensuing terror wouldn't necessarily negate their faith, but it would certainly prompt a desperate search for practical measures. Alarms, community watch, physical barriers, to supplement their spiritual resilience. Furthermore, the psychological impact manifested in a pervasive sense of existential vulnerability. The Vikings, with their swift, unpredictable raids, demonstrated that no place, however sacred or remote, was truly safe. This realization eroded the sense of established order and predictability that had characterized much of Anglo-Saxon life. The sea, once a symbol of connection and trade, transformed into a harbinger of dread, its vastness now representing an open gateway for terrifying incursions. This psychological shift is akin to discovering a hidden vulnerability in a system you believed to be infallible. For generations, the English had operated under the implicit assumption of their own security, a confidence bolstered by distance, and a belief in the inherent superiority of their Christian civilization. The Viking raids forced a jarring recalibration of this perspective, instilling a deep-seated anxiety about external threats that would shape their strategic thinking and societal priorities for centuries to come. Building on this, however, the psychological impact also fostered a nascent sense of pan-Anglo-Saxon identity. Prior to the widespread Viking threat, the various kingdoms of England often engaged in internal rivalries and conflicts. The common, terrifying enemy from the north, however, began to create a shared experience of fear and a collective need for defense that transcended these regional divisions. This shared vulnerability, born from the ashes of Lindisfarne, started to weave a common thread through the disparate political entities. It was a painful, albeit effective catalyst for recognizing a shared destiny, a collective need to stand together against an existential threat that spared no kingdom. This is not unlike how external pressures in modern times can sometimes forge stronger alliances between previously disparate nations, highlighting shared values and common interests in the face of a mutual challenge. Consequently, the psychological trauma of Lindisfarne instilled a deep-seated pragmatism and a newfound appreciation for martial preparedness. The monks' reliance on spiritual fortitude was now augmented by the grim understanding that earthly strength and strategic thinking were indispensable. This wasn't a rejection of faith, but an integration of it with a more grounded, even fearful, understanding of the world. The narrative shifted from one of passive divine protection to one of active, human-led defense, a necessary adaptation to a new and brutal reality. This pragmatic shift is evident in the subsequent military developments and fortifications that began to emerge across England. The psychological scars of Lindisfarne served as a constant, potent reminder that the spiritual and the material realms were not entirely separate, and that true security required vigilance and strength on both fronts. The psychological impact of Lindisfarne extended beyond mere fear. It instilled a profound reevaluation of the nature of resilience. Previously, the Anglo-Saxons had largely equated resilience with steadfastness in faith and the endurance of hardship through divine fortitude. The Viking raid, however, introduced a starkly different paradigm: resilience as proactive adaptation and strategic foresight. This wasn't about passively enduring. It was about actively changing in response to a new threat. Consider how this might manifest in modern times. A company that had always weathered economic downturns through sheer perseverance and loyalty suddenly finds itself outmaneuvered by agile, disruptive competitors. Its old methods of resilience prove insufficient, forcing a fundamental shift towards innovation, market diversification, and rapid response mechanisms to survive. The Anglo-Saxons, much like this hypothetical company, were compelled to move beyond mere endurance towards a more dynamic form of survival. Furthermore, this redefinition of resilience necessitated a recalibration of risk perception. The Vikings, with their audacious maritime raids, introduced an unpredictable element that defied traditional risk assessments. Their attacks were not the predictable skirmishes with neighboring kingdoms. They were lightning strikes from an unseen horizon, exploiting vulnerabilities that had previously been considered negligible. This forced a constant state of heightened awareness, a perpetual scanning of the horizon not just for familiar threats but for the utterly unexpected. Think about how modern cybersecurity operates. It's not just about defending against known viruses, but about anticipating and mitigating entirely novel forms of digital attack, requiring continuous learning and adaptation. The Anglo-Saxons, in their own medieval context, began to develop a similar, albeit cruder, form of anticipatory defense, recognizing that the greatest risks often came from the least expected quarters. Building on this, however, the psychological trauma also fostered a deeper understanding of interconnectedness and interdependence. The isolation that had once been Lindisfarne's perceived strength now highlighted the vulnerability of any single point within the broader network of Anglo-Saxon settlements. The fall of one sacred site sent tremors through the entire region, demonstrating that the fate of one community was intrinsically linked to the security of others. This realization began to chip away at the intensely localized loyalties that had often defined Anglo-Saxon society. Now consider how a natural disaster, like a widespread flood, can reveal the fragility of individual communities and necessitate a coordinated regional response. Resources, information, and mutual aid become paramount, binding disparate groups together through shared adversity. The Viking raids played a similar role, forcing a nascent recognition of a collective vulnerability that transcended local allegiances. Consequently, this period saw a profound shift in the valorization of different skills. While martial prowess had always been respected, the Viking threat elevated the importance of seafaring knowledge, coastal defense strategies, and the ability to anticipate and react to rapid movements. The monk, once the primary symbol of societal contribution, now had to share the stage with the skilled mariner, the vigilant watchman, and the resourceful builder of fortifications. This wasn't a denigration of spiritual or intellectual pursuits, but a pragmatic acknowledgement that survival in this new era demanded a broader spectrum of competencies. Imagine a society that traditionally lauded its philosophers, only to find itself under siege, suddenly elevating the status of its engineers and strategists, recognizing that practical skills were now as vital as abstract thought for immediate survival. The psychological landscape of Anglo-Saxon England began to reflect this expanded hierarchy of essential skills. The terror unleashed at Lindisfarne did more than simply shatter illusions of security. It fundamentally reoriented the Anglo-Saxon understanding of time itself. Before this cataclysmic event, time was largely perceived as cyclical, governed by the predictable rhythm of seasons, agricultural cycles, and the established liturgical calendar. The future was an extrapolation of the present, a continuation of a divinely ordained, ordered progression. The Viking raid, however, introduced a starkly different temporal dimension: the rupture. It was a violent interruption, a moment where the predictable flow of time was violently severed, replaced by a chaotic, unpredictable present. Consider how a sudden, catastrophic natural disaster, like an earthquake or a widespread plague, can instantly obliterate the sense of linear progression, forcing individuals and societies to grapple with a shattered present and an uncertain future. The Anglo-Saxons were thrust into this state, where the familiar markers of time, the planting seasons, the feast days, the very rhythm of their lives, were rendered meaningless in the face of immediate existential threat. The future, once a horizon of predictable continuity, became a question mark, a vast unknown fraught with peril. Furthermore, this temporal rupture fostered a new appreciation for historical memory as a tool of survival. In the wake of such an unprecedented shock, the past ceased to be merely a collection of stories or genealogies. It became a repository of lessons, a source of warnings, and a foundation for rebuilding. The survivors, and those who heard their harrowing tales, were compelled to scrutinize the past for any precedent, any clue that might offer guidance in navigating this new, terrifying reality. This wasn't a passive recollection. It was an active, almost desperate engagement with history, seeking patterns and strategies that could help them anticipate and counter future incursions. Picture a community that has faced a devastating flood and now obsessively studies historical records of past inundations, looking for details about water levels, flood defenses, and evacuation routes, not just for academic interest, but for the very survival of the next generation. The Anglo-Saxons, similarly, began to imbue their historical narratives with a new urgency, transforming them into crucial instructional manuals for a world irrevocably changed. Building on this, however, the raid also introduced a new understanding of agency versus fate. While the Anglo-Saxons had always acknowledged divine will, their pre-raid worldview likely emphasized a more passive acceptance of fate, trusting in God's plan to guide and protect them. Lindisfarne demonstrated that while divine will might be immutable, human action and strategic foresight played a crucial active role in navigating the challenges presented by that will. The monks' lack of earthly defenses, despite their profound spiritual devotion, highlighted that faith alone was insufficient when confronted by determined human agency. This led to a subtle but significant shift in perspective. The future was not solely predetermined. It could be actively shaped or at least influenced by human decisions and preparations. Consider how a society accustomed to believing that prosperity is solely a gift from the heavens might, after a devastating famine caused by poor agricultural practices, begin to emphasize the importance of innovative farming techniques and resource management, recognizing that human effort is a vital component in securing one's future, even within a divinely ordered universe. The Anglo-Saxons, in their struggle to rebuild and defend, began to embrace this more active role in shaping their destiny. Consequently, this historical rupture fostered a deeper understanding of narrative as a form of resistance. The very act of recording the events at Lindisfarne, of preserving the memory of the raid and its horrors, became a form of defiance against the overwhelming force that had sought to obliterate them. By documenting their suffering and their struggle, the Anglo-Saxons asserted their existence, their resilience, and their determination to endure. The scribes who painstakingly etched the accounts into parchment were not just historians. They were warriors of memory, ensuring that the saga of their people would not be erased by the violence of their enemies. This act of narrative preservation is akin to oppressed communities today, using oral histories, songs, and written accounts to preserve their cultural identity and resist assimilation. The stories themselves become a bulwark, a testament to their enduring spirit, ensuring that their history, and therefore their future, could not be entirely dictated by their oppressors. The brutal efficiency of the Viking raid fundamentally reshaped the Anglo-Saxon understanding of information warfare. Prior to Lindisfarne, communication and the dissemination of news were largely localized, relying on messengers, oral traditions, and the slow spread of written accounts through ecclesiastical networks. The Vikings, however, understood the power of psychological impact and the strategic value of instilling fear. Their sudden, devastating appearance, coupled with the subsequent accounts of their ferocity, acted as a potent form of information dissemination, traveling faster and with more visceral impact than any carefully penned decree. Now, consider how this applies when you face a sudden, unexpected crisis. The initial wave of news, often fragmented and terrifying, can paralyze action. The Vikings, in essence, weaponized this initial chaos, their very presence and the speed of their destruction, creating a narrative of overwhelming power that preceded any organized resistance. The shattering of Lindisfarne wasn't just a physical blow. It was a propaganda victory, a demonstration that the established order was not only vulnerable, but also incapable of preventing such swift, brutal incursions. Furthermore, building upon this concept, the Anglo-Saxon response to Lindisfarne necessitated a critical re-evaluation of intelligence gathering and reconnaissance. The monks, isolated and devout, had no early warning system, no network of coastal watchers or informants to signal the approach of danger. Their first intimation of the threat was the terrifying sight of the longships beaching themselves. This stark failure highlighted the vital importance of understanding the enemy's movements and intentions before they arrived. Imagine a modern business facing intense competition. Relying on past market data alone is insufficient. They must actively engage in competitive intelligence, monitoring rivals' product launches, marketing strategies, and financial reports to anticipate their next moves. Similarly, the Anglo-Saxons were forced to recognize that their security depended not just on divine favor or existing defenses, but on actively seeking out information about potential threats, a practice that was largely alien to their previous, more insular worldview. Consequently, the Lindisfarne raid underscored the critical need for rapid communication and coordinated response. The fragmented nature of Anglo-Saxon political power meant that news traveled slowly, and any organized defense would have been hampered by delays in communication between different kingdoms and settlements. The Vikings, by contrast, operated with a swiftness that exploited this weakness. Their ability to strike, plunder, and disappear before any significant force could be mustered was a testament to their speed and the disunity of their targets. Consider how emergency services today rely on sophisticated communication networks, radio, mobile phones, satellite systems, to coordinate responses to disasters. The absence of such infrastructure meant that the Anglo-Saxons were often reacting long after the initial blow had been struck. The trauma of Lindisfarne became a powerful, albeit brutal, lesson in the necessity of establishing more efficient means of transmitting vital information and coordinating defensive actions across wider geographical areas. Another crucial layer to consider is the impact on cultural narrative construction. Before the raid, the dominant narratives in Anglo-Saxon England likely focused on tales of Christian triumph, the spread of faith, and the establishment of a divinely ordained social order. The Viking incursions, however, forced a dramatic recalibration of these narratives. The story of Lindisfarne became a foundational myth of a new era, one defined by struggle, resilience, and the constant threat of external forces. This wasn't a simple retelling of events. It was the deliberate shaping of a collective memory that would inform future generations about the dangers they faced and the qualities necessary for survival. Think about how national origin stories often emerge from periods of profound conflict or existential threat, shaping a people's identity through shared hardship and a narrative of overcoming adversity. The mythos born from Lindisfarne began to weave a new tapestry for Anglo-Saxon identity, one that acknowledged not just divine grace, but also the harsh realities of a dangerous world. The harrowing events at Lindisfarne irrevocably altered the Anglo-Saxon perception of vulnerability and the concept of sanctuary. Before the raid, Lindisfarne stood as a powerful symbol of spiritual impregnability. Its isolation on the island, coupled with its status as a revered monastic center, created an aura of divine protection that was deeply ingrained in the collective consciousness. This wasn't merely a physical location, it was a metaphysical shield, a place where the earthly realm was considered intrinsically connected to and safeguarded by the divine. However, the brutal violation of this sacred space by pagan raiders shattered this deeply held belief. The sanctity of Lindisfarne, once considered an impenetrable fortress against worldly threats, was proven tragically fragile. Now consider how this applies when a deeply trusted institution, or a seemingly secure system, suffers a catastrophic failure. The shock isn't just about the damage done, but about the sudden realization that the very foundations of perceived safety were not as robust as believed, prompting a desperate re-evaluation of what constitutes true security. Furthermore, building on this profound sense of violated sanctuary, the raid compelled a re-examination of defense strategies beyond spiritual reliance. The monks' primary means of protection had been prayer, scripture, and the inherent sanctity of their holy orders. The Viking onslaught demonstrated that while faith might offer solace, it provided little physical resistance against the sharp edge of an axe or the brute force of a boarding party. This forced a pragmatic shift, a dawning realization that earthly defenses, fortifications, trained warriors, and strategic positioning were not merely supplementary to divine protection, but essential components of survival in a world where spiritual purity did not deter pagan aggression. Think about how a community facing persistent wildfires might, after years of relying solely on prayer for protection, begin to invest heavily in fire breaks, early warning systems, and evacuation plans, recognizing that proactive material measures are indispensable alongside spiritual resilience. Consequently, the psychological fallout from Lindisfarne fostered a heightened awareness of strategic positioning and the importance of surveillance. The island's very isolation, once a symbol of its purity, became its fatal flaw, providing no early warning and no escape route for its inhabitants. The Vikings' ability to approach unseen, strike with devastating speed, and depart before any meaningful response could be mounted exposed a critical deficiency in Anglo-Saxon defense doctrine. This realization spurred a greater emphasis on coastal watchtowers, regular patrols, and the development of more effective communication networks, however rudimentary, to detect approaching threats. Imagine a modern nation-state facing an unseen cyber threat. It wouldn't just rely on antivirus software, but would invest heavily in sophisticated intelligence gathering, network monitoring, and predictive analysis to detect and neutralize threats before they could inflict damage. The Anglo-Saxons, in their own context, began to understand the vital necessity of proactive observation and intelligence. Another crucial layer to this evolving understanding of vulnerability was the impact on historical narrative and the construction of victimhood. The story of Lindisfarne, as it was recounted and preserved, transformed the monks from passive recipients of divine grace into active martyrs. Their suffering and slaughter became a powerful narrative of sacrifice, a testament to the brutality of the pagan world and the righteousness of their Christian cause. This narrative served not only to memorialize the fallen, but also to galvanize resistance and foster a shared sense of grievance that could unite disparate communities. Consider how the narratives surrounding pivotal historical tragedies, from the fall of Rome to more recent conflicts, are carefully constructed to shape collective memory, emphasizing heroism, betrayal, and the enduring spirit of a people, thus influencing future actions and identities. The Lindisfarne saga became a foundational element in this evolving historical consciousness, a stark reminder of past horrors that informed future strategies and cemented a collective identity forged in shared vulnerability and the enduring quest for security. The brutal efficiency of the Viking raid fundamentally reshaped the Anglo-Saxon understanding of information warfare. Before Lindisfarne, communication and the dissemination of news were largely localized, relying on messengers, oral traditions, and the slow spread of written accounts through ecclesiastical networks. The Vikings, however, understood the power of psychological impact and the strategic value of instilling fear. Their sudden, devastating appearance, coupled with the subsequent accounts of their ferocity, acted as a potent form of information dissemination, traveling faster and with more visceral impact than any carefully penned decree. Now, consider how this applies when you face a sudden, unexpected crisis. The initial wave of news, often fragmented and terrifying, can paralyze action. The Vikings, in essence, weaponized this initial chaos, their very presence and the speed of their destruction creating a narrative of overwhelming power that preceded any organized resistance. The shattering of Lindisfarne wasn't just a physical blow, it was a propaganda victory, a demonstration that the established order was not only vulnerable, but also incapable of preventing such swift, brutal incursions. Furthermore, building upon this concept, the Anglo-Saxon response to Lindisfarne necessitated a critical reevaluation of intelligence gathering and reconnaissance. The monks, isolated and devout, had no early warning system, no network of coastal watchers or informants to signal the approach of danger. Their first intimation of the threat was the terrifying sight of the longships beaching themselves. This stark failure highlighted the vital importance of understanding the enemy's movements and intentions before they arrived. Imagine a modern business facing intense competition. Relying on past market data alone is insufficient. They must actively engage in competitive intelligence, monitoring rivals' product launches, marketing strategies, and financial reports to anticipate their next moves. Similarly, the Anglo-Saxons were forced to recognize that their security depended not just on divine favor or existing defenses, but on actively seeking out information about potential threats, a practice that was largely alien to their previous, more insular worldview. Consequently, the Lindisfarne raid underscored the critical need for rapid communication and coordinated response. The fragmented nature of Anglo-Saxon political power meant that news traveled slowly, and any organized defense would have been hampered by delays in communication between different kingdoms and settlements. The Vikings, by contrast, operated with a swiftness that exploited this weakness. Their ability to strike, plunder, and disappear before any significant force could be mustered was a testament to their speed and the disunity of their targets. Consider how emergency services today rely on sophisticated communication networks, radio, mobile phones, satellite systems, to coordinate responses to disasters. The absence of such infrastructure meant that the Anglo-Saxons were often reacting long after the initial blow had been struck. The trauma of Lindisfarne became a powerful, albeit brutal, lesson in the necessity of establishing more efficient means of transmitting vital information and coordinating defensive actions across wider geographical areas. Another crucial layer to this evolving understanding of vulnerability was the impact on historical narrative and the construction of victimhood. The story of Lindisfarne, as it was recounted and preserved, transformed the monks from passive recipients of divine grace into active martyrs. Their suffering and slaughter became a powerful narrative of sacrifice, a testament to the brutality of the pagan world and the righteousness of their Christian cause. This narrative served not only to memorialize the fallen, but also to galvanize resistance and foster a shared sense of grievance that could unite disparate communities. Think about how the narratives surrounding pivotal historical tragedies, from the fall of Rome to more recent conflicts, are carefully constructed to shape collective memory, emphasizing heroism, betrayal, and the enduring spirit of a people, thus influencing future actions and identities. The Lindisfarne saga became a foundational element in this evolving historical consciousness, a stark reminder of past horrors that informed future strategies and cemented a collective identity forged in shared vulnerability and the enduring quest for security. The brutal efficiency of the Viking raid fundamentally reshaped the Anglo-Saxon understanding of information warfare. Before Lindisfarne, communication and the dissemination of news were largely localized, relying on messengers, oral traditions, and the slow spread of written accounts through ecclesiastical networks. The Vikings, however, understood the power of psychological impact and the strategic value of instilling fear. Their sudden, devastating appearance, coupled with the subsequent accounts of their ferocity, acted as a potent form of information dissemination, traveling faster and with more visceral impact than any carefully penned decree. Now, consider how this applies when you face a sudden, unexpected crisis. The initial wave of news, often fragmented and terrifying, can paralyze action. The Vikings, in essence, weaponized this initial chaos, their very presence and the speed of their destruction creating a narrative of overwhelming power that preceded any organized resistance. The shattering of Lindisfarne wasn't just a physical blow, it was a propaganda victory, a demonstration that the established order was not only vulnerable, but also incapable of preventing such swift, brutal incursions. Furthermore, building upon this concept, the Anglo-Saxon response to Lindisfarne necessitated a critical reevaluation of intelligence gathering and reconnaissance. The monks, isolated and devout, had no early warning system, no network of coastal watchers or informants to signal the approach of danger. Their first intimation of the threat was the terrifying sight of the longships beaching themselves. This stark failure highlighted the vital importance of understanding the enemy's movements and intentions before they arrived. Imagine a modern business facing intense competition. Relying on past market data alone is insufficient. They must actively engage in competitive intelligence, monitoring rivals' product launches, marketing strategies, and financial reports to anticipate their next moves. Similarly, the Anglo-Saxons were forced to recognize that their security depended not just on divine favor or existing defenses, but on actively seeking out information about potential threats, a practice that was largely alien to their previous, more insular worldview. Consequently, the Lindisfarne raid underscored the critical need for rapid communication and coordinated response. The fragmented nature of Anglo-Saxon political power meant that news traveled slowly, and any organized defense would have been hampered by delays in communication between different kingdoms and settlements. The Vikings, by contrast, operated with a swiftness that exploited this weakness. Their ability to strike, plunder, and disappear before any significant force could be mustered was a testament to their speed and the disunity of their targets. Consider how emergency services today rely on sophisticated communication networks, radio, mobile phones, satellite systems, to coordinate responses to disasters. The absence of such infrastructure meant that the Anglo-Saxons were often reacting long after the initial blow had been struck. The trauma of Lindisfarne became a powerful, albeit brutal, lesson in the necessity of establishing more efficient means of transmitting vital information and coordinating defensive actions across wider geographical areas. Another crucial layer to this evolving understanding of vulnerability was the impact on historical narrative and the construction of victimhood. The story of Lindisfarne, as it was recounted and preserved, transformed the monks from passive recipients of divine grace into active martyrs. Their suffering and slaughter became a powerful narrative of sacrifice, a testament to the brutality of the pagan world and the righteousness of their Christian cause. This narrative served not only to memorialize the fallen, but also to galvanize resistance and foster a shared sense of grievance that could unite disparate communities. Think about how the narratives surrounding pivotal historical tragedies, from the fall of Rome to more recent conflicts, are carefully constructed to shape collective memory, emphasizing heroism, betrayal, and the enduring spirit of a people, thus influencing future actions and identities. The Lindisfarne saga became a foundational element in this evolving historical consciousness, a stark reminder of past horrors that informed future strategies and cemented a collective identity forged in shared vulnerability and the enduring quest for security. Reflecting on this journey thus far, we stand at a precipice, gazing into the confluence of forces that have reshaped the very bedrock of a civilization. The initial tremors of disruption, once dismissed as distant rumblings, have now carved deep canyons into the landscape of the known. What began as a stark confrontation with the unexpected has evolved into a profound reevaluation of fundamental assumptions, a shedding of comforting illusions that once insulated a world from its own latent vulnerabilities. The threads of defiance, resilience, and the dawning awareness of a more complex, interconnected reality have begun to weave a new tapestry, one whose patterns were unimaginable in the serene dawn of that fateful year. As we pivot towards the final reflection, consider the cumulative effect of these revelations, the shattering of a perceived divine shield, the urgent necessity for pragmatic adaptation, and the dawning realization that survival often hinges on embracing the uncomfortable truths that lie just beyond our established horizons. The echoes of that initial shattering reverberate, not as a mere historical echo, but as a living testament to the transformative power of profound disruption. In light of these insights, the path forward, towards understanding the enduring resonance of this ancient narrative, becomes clearer. The seeds of change, sown in the ashes of a violated sanctuary, have sprouted in unexpected ways, influencing not just the immediate responses of a beleaguered populace, but also the very way in which they perceived their place in the world and their capacity to shape it. The initial shock, the raw terror, has given way to a deeper, more nuanced understanding of how external pressures can forge internal strength, how the unexpected can illuminate hidden potentials, and how the very act of confronting overwhelming adversity can forge a new collective identity. It is as if a dormant seed, long buried beneath the soil of complacency, has finally been awakened by a tempest, its roots now reaching deeper, its nascent growth spurred by the very forces that threaten to extinguish it. Drawing these strands together, we see a narrative arc that transcends the mere recounting of historical events. It speaks to a fundamental human experience, the moment when the comfortable certainty of the familiar is irrevocably challenged, forcing a confrontation with the raw, unvarnished realities of existence. The enduring power of this tale lies not in its depiction of a singular brutal act, but in its exploration of the subsequent metamorphosis, the profound internal and external shifts that ripple outward from such a pivotal moment. As we approach the culmination of this narrative, it is this enduring legacy of transformation, this testament to the human capacity to adapt and redefine itself in the face of cataclysm, that commands our attention and invites our deepest contemplation. The salt-laced wind that once whispered tales of distant lands now carries the weight of a profound and irreversible shift. Lindisfarne, that jewel of Northumbrian piety, was not merely a monastery desecrated. It was the shattering of an illusion, the brutal unveiling of a world far more perilous and complex than the serene chance of its monks had ever allowed. The laughter of the English nobility, so dismissive of the northern barbarians, was silenced by the chilling roar of longships and the screams of the slaughtered. This was not an isolated raid. It was the harbinger of an age, the moment when the perceived invincibility of a civilization crumbled under the relentless force of a people forged by the unforgiving sea. The very concept of sanctuary was redefined, not by divine grace but by the stark necessity of earthly vigilance. What emerged from the smoldering ruins was not just a people gripped by fear, but a civilization forced into a crucible of transformation. The passive acceptance of fate, once a cornerstone of their worldview, gave way to a nascent pragmatism, an urgent understanding that the future was not merely a divine decree, but a landscape to be actively shaped, defended, and understood. The lessons learned from the violation of Lindisfarne were etched not just in the chronicles of horrified scribes, but in the very soul of the land. They spoke of the dangers of underestimation, the fragility of perceived security, and the undeniable truth that the world beyond one's borders held forces capable of reshaping destiny itself. The sea, once a symbol of peaceful passage, became a highway of dread, a constant reminder that vulnerability could strike from the most unexpected quarters. This narrative is not merely a recounting of a historical event. It is a timeless parable of awakening. It compels us to look beyond the comforting narratives we construct, to acknowledge the shadows that lurk beyond our illuminated sanctuaries, and to understand that true resilience is not born of passive faith alone, but of a vigilant, adaptive spirit. The echoes of Lindisfarne serve as a potent reminder that the greatest threats often emerge from the places we least expect, and that the capacity for transformation, for forging strength from the ashes of devastation, lies within us all. The true practice of understanding this enduring legacy, of applying its lessons to the ever-shifting tides of our own present, begins now.